Okay, let's start taking a look at Europe. When you're looking at Europe, one of the really key aspects that you have to always keep in mind is that one, it's very small, relatively speaking to other areas, and two, it's incredibly complicated. Much of Europe is basically very accessible. It's accessible by water, it's accessible by moving from east to west or west to east. And so what you have is movements of populations all throughout this area constantly, right down till today. And what this means is when you think of sections of Europe, you have to understand that that's very much sort of in the eye of the beholder. Someplace like Germany seems like a country where it's all unified ethnically, and in some ways it is. But on the other hand, remember, Germany as a country didn't exist until 1871 or something like that. And there's still enormous differences between the north and the south, say in Bavaria and stuff like that, versus say in the north. So this seeming sort of unity from country to country is sort of an illusion. And if you actually look at it just in this image, you can see that the ability to move from one area to the other, staying out of the dark green, is actually very easy. The Northern European plain, for example. The other key aspect is if you look at this coastline, it's very convoluted. More importantly than just the fact that it's convoluted in the sense there's all sorts of embayments and there's little coastal villages, et cetera, as much of it's protected. It's not particularly hospitable, but you got the Baltic in the north, the Mediterranean in the south, the Black Sea over here. All these are very protected waters. So what this means for much of Europe, getting around by water is really, really, really easy compared to almost any place else on Earth. And this leads to some peculiar situations that lead to Europe being what it is, the way we see it now. The other thing that's important to remember, especially given what I was talking about this class in general, is that this class and the whole Western academic tradition of a university like this is very much ingrained and embedded within the European concept of sort of collective and individual identity. So universities in the Western intellectual system are a European invention, the European construct. And so they reflect the values and attitudes that tend to, be fairly common in most of Europe. And this is, unlike other areas. So this class, for example, is very much a European class. In fact, that's what, as I think I mentioned before, European students take this class several times before they get to university. So it's very much embedded within that particular context and framework. To put this all in a context, This all in a context, you have to remember that till the early 19th century, I'll say 1830, 1840, the way that you got around was basically one of two choices. You either walked, you had a horse-drawn wagon, or you rode a horse, or you went by boat, some sort of a boat. Of those three, if you think about it, if you're trying to build a house, if you're trying to move construction materials, say bricks, from point A to point B, if you're going to carry them by hand, that ain't going to work very well, especially with places like 10 miles away or more. Can't move many bricks that way. If you're going to try to move them by wagon, you still can't, because most wagons, by the time you design the wagon to be strong enough out of wood to hold the bricks, and you've got the limitations that you literally got a 1 horsepower machine or 1 oxen powered machine, as in 1 horsepower. Remember, even a moped has maybe 15 horsepower. You have absolutely no energy to make those movements. And then you don't have any investment on the road. So basically what you're doing is you're moving on dirt roads, which of course, if it's raining, as it does in a lot of Europe, it's muddy roads. And so what you have is basically your ability to move stuff around on land is almost non-existent. You can move incredibly small amounts of stuff, but it's incredibly difficult. And what this means is any part of the planet which has easily accessible rivers, and this has to be two things. It's not that the river is just the river's there. The river has to be slow moving. It has to be predictable. It can't have a strong current because you don't have motors. So therefore, you have to have slow moving rivers. There's sort of, benign, happy things with willows growing in on the side and, and all that type of stuff. And Europe is just loaded with those. The vast majority of rivers in Europe are fairly large in the sense that you can move boats on them, at least good sized boats. They're not fast running. And this means that, for thousands of years, people have been able to move large, heavy stuff by just piling a bunch of it on a barge, or even just a log raft. You can just tow tons of stuff. The number of bricks you can move by hand is 0, maybe 10. The number of bricks you can pile into even just a log raft is absolutely huge, as long as where you want to take the bricks to is on a river. So one of the huge advantages that Europe had, and to a certain extent still has today over almost any place else, is the absolutely enormous network of functional river systems. And this basically has tied almost all of Europe together for a long time. This is one reason why the Roman Empire existed. The Romans were famous for road building, but they were also probably even more famous for moving stuff by water, which is one reason they made such amazing engineering achievements. So, you have to remember that till the 1830s, you have no roads. Macadam was a Scottish engineer, as I remember. And so the idea of paving roads, had to wait till the mid 19th century. And even then, you're familiar with the roads here. You don't just put asphalt down on something. You have this whole engineering process of putting, leveling it out, draining it, putting gravel down, putting rock down, and then putting a sealant on top. The Roman Empire, again, was famous for the road building. But if you look at the road engineering of the Romans, it's absolutely mind-blowing the amount of effort that it took to put in a mile of road. Now, those roads lasted for, in some cases, they're still in use 2,000 years later, but they were very, very limited in terms of where they could go. They were very limited in terms of what they could do. And to a certain extent, they were also very limited in terms of what you could do, because you're still limited to a wagon and a horse. You're still on a 1 horsepower machine. And, if you want to put it in a technical sense, if you're going to run a wagon with, say, 2 horses, you're limited to about 800 pounds of stuff, which is less than you can carry around in the Toyota Prius. So, the ability to move stuff around is almost entirely non-existent unless you've got access to easily moving water systems. And that's the success of Europe. The success of Europe was, 1, easy moving water systems, and 2, the fact that Europe is just scattered with resources. There's not a lot. You don't have the world's largest gold mines or copper mines or coal mines in Europe, but scattered all throughout Europe, you have some of those. And what this meant is in Europe, you could always find access to lead or to silver or to copper or, even, chert or something else that you need. And so Europe had incredibly diverse resources. And what this means is when technology starts to expand, both, say in the period of the Roman Empire, but also by the 1600s, when people start to come up with new technology, you've got all the resources in place in Europe, 1, to make those changes, to come up with, for example, advanced iron and then steel. And also along with that, you've got, by virtue of the rivers, the ability to move raw materials like large amounts of coal or iron ore, et cetera, in an efficient system using the rivers to make that happen. This is why the Industrial Revolution occurs first in Europe. It's because the combination of resources and accessibility allows it to happen. People had the idea of doing that. You go back 3,000 or 4,000 years in China, and you can see they're trying to do industrial size stuff. But in much of China, you don't have access to useful rivers, for example, where you need them compared to the resources. And so you were always limited in moving stuff from point A to point B because point B wasn't where you needed it to be, for example. So Europe has an enormous advantage, you might say, in terms of literally the physical geology and geography of Europe in general, allowed, technology and especially industrialization to move at a much more rapid pace than it could in almost any place else, even, for example, in the United States. Because, again, the distances in the United States meant that you had more in the way of resources. But getting those resources from where they were to where you wanted to do your industrialization was a more complicated task. So industrialization in the United States is usually about 20 years behind Europe, just because it requires, ironically, more advanced technology to get these more massed resources to where you need them. Okay, we talked about sociobiology before. Sociobiology in the European sense is really interesting because it's almost invariably tied to a combination of language and ethnic identity. It very rarely is tied to physical differences in the sense of, visible differences, say, in skin color or even stature and such like that. So sociobiology is a very, very interesting part of the European tradition. The French see themselves as actually being physically different than the British or the Germans, for example. And this is very much tied to ideas of behavior. Anywhere in Europe you go to, people will talk about the folks around them as if they're different in terms of their perception, their behavior, their attitudes, and their values. The French attitude towards the Dutch, for example, the German attitude towards the British, all the, or say the French attitude towards Italians. All these groups are heavily stereotyped in terms of sort of a package of behavior that's based in place, and somehow that's tied to sort of ethnic heritage and genetics. Again, as I mentioned right at the start of this, that's really bogus because these folks are scattered all over the place and they moved all over the place. And so, these arguments have no validity per se, but they're hugely powerful and still in many ways define how Europeans see each other and see themselves. From our standpoint, what we want to basically define this as is ethnic identity. I would argue that everyone in Europe identifies themselves on the basis of ethnicity. Having said that, it's important to remember that for Europeans, ethnic identity is very different than, for example, how many Americans see it. And so when you're looking at this idea of ethnic identity in the sense of Europe, it's really important because what happens in Europe in between, say, the 1600s and say the early 1800s or mid 1800s is at some point you move from the idea of monarchies. And I think I mentioned this before, the idea that basically individuals and families run a place and you swear allegiance to that family. So you belong to the British king, or you belong to the French king or the German Kaiser or whatever. By the 1800s, what happens is this changes. And in many countries, these monarchies disappear. The French Revolution being a good case, where they literally disappear. And so what happens is when these get replaced, even if the monarchies show back up, so by the 1820s, there's now a French monarch again. But in that process, what's happened is France isn't the same country it was. Up until 1789, France was a country ruled by a king, and you swore allegiance to that family, the Bourbons. With the French Revolution, and even after the French Revolution, you don't swear allegiance to the king. Now you see yourself as an ethnic group. You see yourself as La France. You see yourself as French. And you now have a national anthem, which is a really sort of interesting point, because prior to this, you didn't. National anthems are really interesting musical numbers because they're part of this idea of ethnic identity. And then very much the European sense, they have La Marseillaise for the French. And what happened is the French now see themselves from that moment on as La France. They see themselves as the country of France that's tied to a ethnic identity and a cultural, social dynamic that makes them unique to themselves and different than the folks around them, and unfortunately also better. And this is the problem with ethnicity in Europe. Ethnicity in Europe, as almost every place, isn't just distinguishing yourselves from your neighbors. It's basically implying that you're better than your neighbors. And of course, this leads to the enormous amount of friction, which is why in Europe they always seem to be at war with each other. But what's important to remember is these monarchies disappear in the 19th century, though they might still have someone there. There's still a Kaiser in Germany. Off and on there's French monarchs. But the reality is the country itself has changed. Germany in 1880 wasn't the same as the German states in, say, 1820. For one thing, it was now unified, but there was a very strong sense of German national ethnic identity. And so it really didn't matter who your king was anymore. It didn't matter if you had a Kaiser or not. Germans saw themselves as being German. They didn't see themselves as Bavarians or Swabians or Pomeranians or all the other groups that they had prior to that. Now they were Germans. And this actually occurs while the monarchies are still sort of in place. But this is why you have World War I and World War II. World War I and World War II are ethnic conflicts. They're not run by individuals. Hitler existed because of the ethnic identity of German, which is that video, which is a good part of what that video is talking about that you're watching. So it's important to remember that what you have is ethnic identity becomes the nation state. So by the mid-late 19th century, in some cases intentionally calculated, in other cases just sort of happens, almost every place in Europe starts to see itself, its national boundaries now become defined by an ethnicity. So within that, you have an ethnic group that basically see themselves as reflecting the nation state. Now, of course, it's important to remember in almost all these countries, there's actually minorities or other groups that aren't reflected in that ethnic identity. And so these nation states are actually pretty fragile. Spain probably being the classic example right now, because you have Spanish national sort of ethnic nation identity, but the Catalonians and the Basque and groups in other parts of Spain don't buy into it and aren't a part of it. And so they're therefore, well, why should we be part of this country when it doesn't reflect our ethnicity, our values, our attitudes? So the nation state identity that you see in Europe, and this also includes, for example, Russia then, is problematic because it's not based, one, on history, two, it's not based on sort of a collective agreement. It's based on, in some cases, a minority group gaining power and collect control. In other cases, a majority group, and almost invariably, they're not very tolerant of anyone else. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, as we are here in January 22, you can see this really coming to fore. Right now, the general assumption of the State Department here in the United States is that Russia will invade the Ukraine by February at the latest, which, no one knows how that's going to escalate, but it's somewhere way beyond terrifying. That whole decision is based on two ethnic groups. As we'll see, I'm not getting there yet, but the Rus, or the idea of Russian national ethnic identity, is tied with what's called White Russian, or the Rus. And that would be Putin and the group that basically identifies as the Russian state. It's that ethnic identity. The Ukraine is a different ethnic group. They're both technically Slavic in the sense they speak similar languages, but they're not the same thing. And with the idea of the Rus, our idea of Russians in the 21st century, that ethnic group and their country, i.e. Russia, they see a large chunk of the Ukraine is actually, by virtue of history or whatever spin they're putting on it, it should belong to them. The folks that are Ukrainian don't agree with that. And right now you've got 250 Russians massed on the Ukrainian border with ready to pull a trigger, and who knows how many Ukrainians massed also. And the interesting thing about this is what you find is the rest of Europe being drawn into this because of the European Union, as we'll get into in a second. And then ironically, what's happening is with the European countries that have to decide, are they going to go to war with Russia over the Ukraine? A lot of the decision making that they're doing isn't based purely on economics, it's based on ethnicity. Well, the Ukrainians really aren't Germans, the Ukrainians aren't French, the Ukrainians aren't Belgians. So why should the Germans and the Belgians or the French go to war over them? Which, if you know anything about world history, sounds a lot like Czechoslovakia in the 1936 period. So there's a whole sort of very terrifying scenarios that are playing out literally as we speak. And by the time you watch this, I don't know what will happen. But it's very much tied to this idea of ethnicity being the key way that people identify in the 21st century. This also gets convoluted into religion, because what you find is in some groups, ethnicity gets tied to religion. So a particular ethnic group has a different version, variant form of whatever religious system is in place compared to their neighbors. In some cases, what you find is ethnicity and religion end up in competition with each other. Sadly to say, Northern Ireland would be a good case in that, where you have your Irish, where there's no disagreement that they're part of the same ethnic group, depending on whether you're Catholic Irish or Protestant Irish. One, you have a slightly different history attached to it, but also what you mean is then religion then deunifies that ethnicity. So religion can act as a unifier, especially in terms of compared to your neighbors. It can also act as a deunifier. One of the contrasts between France and Germany is that Germany tends to have a much higher percentage of Protestants versus Catholics. France is pretty much a Catholic country. And that's one of the ways that the French identify themselves being different in Germany. Now, mind you, there's a bunch of Catholics in Germany, especially in the South. But nonetheless, the French and the Germans see themselves in part defined not only by behavior and attitudes and values, but also by what they see as variations in religious selection. And language, of course, acts in the same way. The classic example you're going to see in, this semester, I think, if not certainly by the end of this year, is whether Belgium, the country of Belgium, will remain intact. In Belgium, which has two ethnic groups, the northern part are the Flemish, and the southern part, I believe, are called Walloons. The northern part speak basically Dutch/German, and they're Protestant. The folks in the south speak, largely French, and they're largely Catholic. Belgium as a country was sort of defined by not wanting to be part of France, not wanting to be part of Holland/whatever, nor Germany. And it's been around since I think the 1830s. But right now, the folks in the South don't feel like the country reflects them, and they want to separate into those two ethnic groups and make two countries out of Belgium, which is very likely going to happen. The complication you get into is there's also other minority groups within each of those areas that they don't want to be Walloon, they don't want to be Flemish because they're something else. So you can see when you start to parse things out on ethnicity, given the definition of ethnicity, especially when you tie religion and language into it, you get down to the point where you basically each country would have 5 people in it. You can start to take it to the extreme. Now, the other part that you have to remember is in the 17 and 1800s, is Europe, by virtue of the Industrial Revolution and just sort of their military superiority in terms of technology and such, they very quickly become the dominant force on much of the planet. So what happens then is when these colonial empires expand, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, and all these guys, it's very much when they look at the rest of the planet that they're taking over, they look at it from the standpoint of their own ethnic cultural superiority or in their home territory. So this tends to push even more this idea of a nation state. So the British control a large proportion of the world's surface by 1900. but all the folks that they control aren't British, and they're never seen as British, because the British mean that you have to be born and be part of the British upbringing in England. So they have an empire, but the nation state is actually still England. There's the British Empire, and their logic for that is, well, we're better than everyone else around us. That's why we control them, because we have our act together better than anyone else does. So we should have a world empire. So this whole colonial logic of superiority and exclusion is very much tied to nation state. Now, the terrifying aspect of this is this all collapses between World War I and, well, basically 1945, as all the European powers basically sort of kill themselves off sort of collectively. So these colonial empires vanish. The last one probably being the French vanishing in Indochina in the 1950s. But the key thing about this is their attitude about superiority still remains. So the British attitude about the rest of the planet, the French attitude about the rest of the planet, German attitude about the rest of the planet really, really hasn't changed very much. They just don't have the empire to sort of back it up. And so, one of the side effects of this is that different parts of Europe had different levels of success in the 1800s. The northern area tended to be much more successful. The southern area, like Greece, Italy, not so much, even Spain. And so when you look at these folks unifying in the late 20th century, these stereotypes the Europeans have, they don't see themselves as a thing. It's not like the states of the United States where you might be from Alabama or you might be from Idaho or something like that. Yeah, you're different, but you're all part of a package deal. Europeans don't have that concept at all. They realize geographically it's a peninsula, but they do not have a sense of collective self. And that's really, really key, because the current issues they've gone through a bunch of crises as we speak. One of the biggest ones is the fact that lack of collective identity is really coming back to bite them in an enormous way.